Let's talk about the Battle of Inchon. If you know anything about the Korean War, you've heard of it. It's one of the most legendary amphibious invasions in history, the kind of move that completely flips the script on a war. And it's almost always seen as General Douglas MacArthur's finest hour.
And you can totally see why. Historian Max Hastings put it perfectly when he wrote that Inchon summons a vision of military genius undulled by time. I mean, what a line, right? It was bold, it was brilliant, and it was an absolutely overwhelming success. It's the perfect story of a heroic general snatching victory from the jaws of defeat.
But what if that's not the whole story? What if that perfect victory, that absolute moment of brilliance, actually planted the seeds for a much, much bigger disaster? What if the success was so complete, so intoxicating, that it accidentally led everyone down a path they were totally unprepared for? Well, that's the real story we're going to dig into.
Okay, so to really get why Inchon was such a big deal, we need to rewind the clock a bit to the summer of 1950. Because for the UN forces in Korea, the situation was, to put it lightly, desperate.
So picture this. After the war kicked off in June, the North Korean People's Army, the KPA, just stormed down the peninsula with incredible speed. By August, the UN and South Korean forces are literally backed into a corner. They're clinging to this tiny little patch of land around the city of Busan with their backs to the sea. They were this close to being pushed right off the map. The war was almost lost.
And this is where General Douglas MacArthur enters the stage. He had this wild idea. He believed the only way out wasn't to try and push from Busan, but to do something totally unexpected, land a massive force way behind enemy lines and cut them off completely. His target? A port city named Inchon, and the plan's code name was Operation Chromite.
Now, what made this plan so incredibly audacious was that just about everyone else thought it was completely insane. One naval commander said Inchon had every natural and geographic handicap you could think of. We're talking massive 30-foot tides, some of the biggest in the world, which meant you only had a tiny window to land your ships. At low tide, the whole harbor turned into miles and miles of thick, impassable mud. On top of that, you had high seawalls surrounding the city and narrow channels that were just begging to be mined. It's really no wonder that most people thought the plan was a suicide mission.
But MacArthur? He looked at all those risks and saw his biggest advantage. He actually compared his plan to General Wolfe's capture of Quebec, where his troops scaled these impossible cliffs that the French thought were totally safe. MacArthur was convinced the North Koreans would never, ever expect an attack at the one place that everyone agreed was impossible. The surprise, he argued, would be total.
The Joint Chiefs of Staff back in Washington were not convinced, not even a little bit. They flew all the way to Tokyo to try and talk him out of it. But then MacArthur gives this legendary 45-minute speech, completely off the cuff, and just lays out his case. He wagered his entire reputation on this thing, calling it a desperate gamble, but one that would wrest victory from defeat. And in the end, his sheer force of personality won them over. The impossible plan got the green light.
And you know what? MacArthur was right. The execution of Operation Chromite on September 15, 1950 was pretty much flawless. It was a jaw-dropping success that absolutely shocked the world.
The whole thing unfolded like clockwork. At first light, the Marines seized Wolmi-do, this key island fortress guarding the harbor. By lunchtime, that tactical key was in their hands. Then, as the evening tide came rushing in, the main force hit the city. You had Marines literally scaling the city's seawalls with ladders, while another force landed just south of there. The defenders were just completely and totally overwhelmed. And the results were just staggering. Within just 1 month of the landing, UN forces had captured 135,000 North Korean soldiers. The North Korean army didn't just retreat, it completely disintegrated.
Strategically, it was a masterstroke. The KPA, who were all focused down south at Busan, suddenly found a massive enemy army in their backyard, sitting right on top of their supply lines. At the same time, the 8th Army broke out of Busan. The KPA was caught in a classic pincer movement and just collapsed. Just like that, the entire tide of the war had reversed.
So far, this sounds like one of the greatest victories of all time. And tactically it was. But this is where our story takes a sharp and dangerous turn. This is the moment where the victory itself becomes the problem. And here is the absolute crux of the issue. This perfect military operation was carried out in a total policy vacuum. The initial goal, remember, was just to save South Korea. But now, with the North Korean army completely shattered, what do you do next? Do you cross the 38th parallel and unify the country? Do you just stop and declare victory? Nobody in Washington had really decided. This confusion was actually baked right into the official policy. Just days before the landing, a document came out called NSC 81/1, and it was a masterpiece of contradiction. On one hand, it said going north of the 38th parallel was beyond the accomplishment of this mission. But on the other hand, it explicitly authorized the UN commander to, you guessed it, operate north of the 38th parallel. It was a policy that was basically designed to avoid making a decision.
Even the top general at the time, Omar Bradley, saw right through it. He called the document a masterpiece of obfuscation, which is just a fancy way of saying it was deliberately confusing and unclear. There was no firm strategic goal for this amazing military victory to serve.
And into that strategy vacuum, the stunning success of Inchon created a kind of momentum that became impossible to control, and it was building towards a much bigger problem.
Inchon made MacArthur a global hero. He was untouchable. As Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State, basically admitted, after a success that brilliant, there's no stopping MacArthur now. The tactical victory was so huge that it created its own political reality. The military objectives started driving the political goals, instead of the other way around. The tail was now wagging the dog.
And all of a sudden, the war's objective changed. It was no longer about simply pushing the invaders out and saving South Korea. The new, undeclared goal became the forcible unification of the entire Korean peninsula. This was classic mission creep, and it was fueled entirely by the euphoria of this unexpected total victory.
This set off a tragic chain reaction, like dominoes falling. First, the tactical victory at Inchon creates this unstoppable momentum. That momentum then rushes into that vacuum of ambiguous war aims. This leads to an unchecked advance north, all the way to the Chinese border at the Yalu River. And that move triggers the one thing American planners had feared the most, a massive intervention by China, which plunged the war into a totally new and far, far bloodier phase.
So when you look back, the landing at Inchon was a brilliant military operation, no question. But its very perfection set in motion a chain of events that led directly to a strategic catastrophe. It leaves us with this really critical question. Can a perfect tactical victory, without a clear strategy to guide it, actually cause a disaster? The story of Inchon seems to suggest that it can. And that's a lesson that remains profoundly relevant even today.